The former chairperson of the VA4 North Village Council, Nancy Charles, has defended herself against allegations of wrongdoing during her tenure. Speaking on the Mr. Chairman program on Calabash TV, the treasurer of the UWP denied ever misappropriating funds belonging to that council. Commenting on the audit into town and village councils commissioned by the Labour administration, Mrs. Charles said the resulting report holds no merit.
The members of the committee were John T. Maffra, and his qualification was a financial analyst from the Office of the Director of Finance. Mr. George Raju, who was an accountant number 2 at the Treasury Department. Emran Matthew, who was an acting accountant number 1 at the Treasury Department. And Ryan Ogis, who's an accounts clerk number 3 at the Treasury Department. If you are going to accuse persons of over millions of dollars being allocated, one has to ask the question, why did the Prime Minister not appoint persons who had a history in auditing, or maybe they were qualified in audit? Why did he not even go through the Director of Audit? But it was an ad hoc committee that was put together and to report to Cabinet, not to report to the Director of Audit, but to report to Cabinet. And most of these people, they are known supporters of the Labour Party. I can say that. People in St. Lucia know them. In fact, there's one of the gentlemen, Emran Matthew, who was an acting accountant, who's since been promoted to the Office of the Prime Minister. And so I don't know if it is reward for something or anything. But at the end of the day, these persons were handpicked by the Prime Minister to go out and to conduct a review of the town and village council and then to be presented to Cabinet.
Nancy Charles said she cooperated with the committee and was surprised by the allegations and conjecture contained in the final report. According to her, every project undertaken was overseen by a quantity surveyor provided by the government, as well as a thorough process vetted by the Taiwanese embassy.
Once a project was identified by the council and a contractor was identified, the contractor was asked to send in an initial quotation or an initial bill of quantities. Once that bill of quantities was submitted, then the quantity surveyor from the ministry would now sit down with the contractor to go over the bill of quantities that he has presented, ensure that he has done it correctly, ensure that the figures are correct, whether he has overstated or understated. And so what you would find happening, some sort of a renegotiation would take place between him and the quantity surveyor to ensure that they came to an agreeable price. And sometimes the price agreed, the final price agreed, would either be lower than what was quoted or sometimes higher than what was quoted. But what this gentleman did, he omitted that fact. He never explained that in the report because all the different quotations were there. But what he did to make it seem that persons were paid in excess of what they were supposed to be paid for, he quoted that the project was quoted at one price, which would have been the initial quotation, and the contractor was paid a different price, which was the renegotiated price. And so all these things were put in the report, and this was not credible, because what the report was there for was to create an impression that this had taken place, but not to produce and to provide all the evidence and all the statements that were given to say, this is what transpired, this is what happened.
And as for the check of nearly $500,000 she wrote for works reportedly not done, well, Nancy Charles says there is a simple explanation.
There were 3 signatories to the account. There was myself, the clerk, and another member of the committee. That around the same time that I had submitted my resignation, the second signatory, he had a stroke. His name was Mr. Rufus from Peru. He had a stroke, and so he was not able to sign or do anything because of the stroke. He was going through rehabilitation. And so what the council had done was to write to the ministry, because the ministry was the one who authorized the opening of the account and the signatories. So we had to write to them to request somebody else to be an authorized signatory to the account to ensure that checks could be written. So upon my resignation, we still had a lot of projects ongoing. I pre-signed some checks so that the clerk could ensure with her and the new chairman, because the new chairman could not sign as yet because the ministry had not sent in the letter, to ensure that ongoing projects would have been paid. And so persons asked, well, if you had resigned, why would there still checks? And I explained that to the gentleman, but they never made that in the report. They never made mention of the gentleman who had the stroke. They never made mention that we had written to the ministry requesting somebody else to be a signatory. They never made mention that I had pre-signed some checks to ensure that payments could be made for projects that were ongoing. They never made mention of any of these things. And they also never made mention of the fact that, with reference to the check for the Viewfort South, the check that was written for $499,000 was never monies allocated for Viewfort North. The monies were allocated for Viewfort South. There was a letter from the Taiwanese embassy indicating that the money was for Viewfort South, and so the money was payable to the contractor for the projects in Viewfort South.
The audit report was submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP, by government for review. However, the DPP has since informed that she needs to be provided with statements and evidentiary material for assessment.